The woods were always whispering. Toby and Ben knew this. They lived on the edge of those woods, in a small town where trees outnumbered houses. The wind rustled leaves, creating a symphony of whispers that echoed through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like voices, murmuring secrets in a language only the forest understood. Toby and Ben were best friends. They did everything together. They built tree houses, chased fireflies, and told each other scary stories. But the one thing they never did was go into the woods at night. Not until today. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Toby and Ben stood at the edge of the woods, their breaths misting in the cooling air. A dare. That's how it started. Ben, ever the brave one, challenged Toby to walk with him to the old gnarled oak tree in the center of the woods. Toby hesitated. He could already feel the darkness closing in, swallowing the last rays of light. The whispering seemed louder now, more insistent. But he couldn't refuse the dare, not in front of Ben. Taking a deep breath, Toby nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's go." They plunged into the woods, the dense canopy of leaves blocking out the last vestiges of daylight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Toby felt a shiver run down his spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. Ben, walking ahead, seemed unfazed. He hummed a tuneless melody, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness of the woods. Toby kept his eyes fixed on Ben's back, afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. The path, barely visible in the fading light, twisted and turned. Toby stumbled over exposed roots, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a sense of unease settle over him, a primal fear that whispered of unseen dangers. He wished they had never made this dare. A sudden movement caught Toby's eye, a flicker of something dark, just for a moment, behind a towering oak tree. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Ben turned, his brow furrowed. "See what?" he asked, his voice casual, but Toby could hear the slight tremor in it. Toby pointed to the spot where he'd seen the movement. "There," he whispered. Something moved. Ben squinted, peering into the deepening gloom. "It's probably just a deer, Toby," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Come on, let's keep going." He started forward again, but Toby hesitated. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, its eyes burning into his back. He took a step forward, then another, forcing himself to follow Ben. The forest seemed to press in around them, the air growing thick and oppressive. The whispering grew louder, the voices seeming to swirl around them, mocking their fear. Toby glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see something sinister lurking behind them. But there was nothing. Just the endless rows of trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, their leaves rustling in the wind. They continued on, the silence broken only by the crunching of leaves beneath their feet and the frantic beating of their hearts. Toby's mind raced, conjuring up images of terrifying creatures hiding in the shadows, waiting to pounce. He had heard the stories, the local legends whispered around campfires. Stories of strange disappearances in these very woods. He was about to suggest they turn back when he saw it. A piece of paper pinned to a tree trunk. It was old and yellowed, the edges curled and brown. As they drew closer, Toby could make out a single word scrawled across it in crude black letters. Leave. The sight of the note sent a shiver down Toby's spine. He reached out a trembling hand and gently pulled it free from the tree. The paper felt brittle and dry beneath his fingers, like it had been there for years. He showed it to Ben, his eyes wide with fear. Ben snatched the note, his own face paling. "This isn't funny, Toby," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't funny at all." He crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles turning white. For the first time since entering the woods, Toby saw fear in his friend's eyes. The wind picked up, swirling around them, whipping the leaves into a frenzy. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like the forest itself was urging them to turn back. Toby felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of town, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. "We should go," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. He looked at Ben, but his friend seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the crumpled note in his hand. "Ben, did you hear me? We need to go. Now." Ben looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever words he was about to utter were snatched away by the wind. The note slipped from his grasp, tumbling across the forest floor, carried away by an unseen current of air. Toby reached out to grab it, but it was too late. The note disappeared into the undergrowth, swallowed by the shadows. He felt a surge of panic. They were alone now, truly alone in the heart of the whispering woods. The wind died down as quickly as it had risen, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the rustling leaves stilled, the whispering voices silenced. Even the air felt different, charged with an unseen energy that made the hairs on the back of Toby's neck stand on end. He looked at Ben, his heart pounding in his chest. His friend seemed to have finally snapped out of his trance, his eyes darting nervously around their surroundings. He could see the fear etched on Ben's face, and it mirrored his own. They stood there for a moment, frozen in place, listening for any sound that might break the unnerving silence. But there was nothing, just the oppressive stillness of the woods pressing in on them like a suffocating blanket. Then, from the depths of the forest, came a sound. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. It was a sound that spoke of something ancient, something predatory, something that did not belong in the world of men. Toby's blood ran cold. He had never heard a sound so primal, so filled with menace. It sent shivers of terror racing down his spine. He looked at Ben, his eyes wide with terror, but his friend was already backing away, his gaze fixed on the darkness that shrouded the trees. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves. Toby felt a surge of adrenaline. They had to get out of there, now! He grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him along, their feet pounding on the forest floor. They ran blindly, their lungs burning, their legs screaming for respite. But the sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer, urging them onward. Branches whipped at their faces, tearing at their clothes, but they didn't dare slow down. Not now, not when they could feel the hot breath of their pursuer on their necks. Toby risked a glance over his shoulder. He could see them now, two glowing eyes like burning embers floating in the darkness. And between them, the faint outline of a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its long limbs moving with an unnatural grace. Terror lent speed to their flight. Toby's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest constricting with every step. He could hear Ben stumbling behind him, his own breathing heavy and labored. But they couldn't stop, not while those glowing eyes were still on their trail. The trees seemed to blur together in a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. Toby's foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling to the ground. He cried out in pain as his ankle twisted beneath him. He tried to scramble back to his feet, but a searing pain shot up his leg, forcing him back down. He looked up, his heart sinking as he saw Ben disappear around a bend in the path. "Ben! Wait!" he cried out, his voice hoarse with fear. But his friend was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. Toby was alone. He could hear the heavy footsteps approaching, each step sending tremors through the ground. The glowing eyes were getting closer, burning into him with a malevolent intensity. He struggled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ankle. He had to keep moving. He had to get away. He limped forward, his eyes scanning the darkening woods for any sign of Ben, any sign of escape. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless labyrinth of trees and shadows. He was trapped, cornered like prey by an unseen predator. He could hear its breath now, a low rasping sound that seemed to suck the air from his lungs. And then he saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, blocking his way, a figure of impossible height and slenderness, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its body draped in a dark, featureless suit. It had no face, just a smooth white expanse where its head should be. Toby froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. This was it. This was what the stories warned of, the Slenderman. He had thought it was just a legend, a scary story to tell around a campfire, but it was real, and it was standing right in front of him. The Slender Man took a step closer, its long, spindly fingers twitching at its sides. Toby wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed with fear, his eyes locked on the creature's blank white face. He felt a cold, unseen hand close around his wrist, its grip like a vice. He tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, sending waves of pain shooting up his arm. He looked down and saw long, slender fingers, as pale as bone, digging into his flesh. The Slender Man was dragging him forward, deeper into the darkness. Toby thrashed against its grip, his cries for help swallowed by the whispering woods. But his struggles were futile. He was no match for the creature's unnatural strength. He caught one last glimpse of the path behind him, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees, and then everything went black. The whispering woods had claimed him.